All right. All right. Sorry about that, everybody. Little technical problems with the YouTube this morning. So welcome to our hungry learners, our compassionate facilitators, cheeky co-creators, change makers, all of you out there who are joining us today. This is Wednesday Web Jam. Every Wednesday at this hour, same channel, same place, we start with a session where we invite a guest to come into our world, come into our sandbox and experiment with us. And today we have Richard Perez, who I'll introduce in just a second. But some of our kind of rules of the game are to be kind, be empathetic, and be nice to one another. So we're all here to learn, and we are going to play together, so play nice. That's basically the message here. I'd love to introduce you all to my new friend, Richard Perez. He's got tons of experience in the innovation space. He's going to tell you all about that here in just a second. And Richard has a career at Procter and Gamble, which, of course, if you're here, you probably read that, but also at a company called Basadur, where they provide an assessment to teams and individuals, and he's going to get into how important your sort of psychological and sociological aspects to innovation are to teams, to leaders, and to individuals doing this change stuff that we do. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back over to you, Richard, and you can start sharing your screen. Thank you. Welcome, sir.
Okay, great to be here. Thanks everyone for joining. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so hopefully you're able to see my PowerPoint. Okay, got the thumbs up from Mark?
Yep.
Okay, so like Mark said, essentially my interactive conversation has two parts to it. The first part is really, kind of like taking a peek inside the tent of this internal capability at P&G, which we call the gym. And, how did that work? And, what were some of the enablers for that capability to be sustainable? And then the other part is a bit of focusing on one of the tools that we leveraged at the gym, which is the Basadur Innovation Profile, which is connected to a book that I just published in partnership with my friend and mentor, Dr. Basadur, which is called Scatterbrains. And we're going to do a bit of an exercise to kind of like map out where each of our styles is, and then we'll have a conversation to debrief what that means, right? So with that, let's just get going. And like Mark said, please use the chat. And I have several wing persons working with me, the whole Wednesday Web Jam team that will be helping me keep monitor the chat, etc. And rattle my cage whenever it needs to be rattled. Okay, so with that, let's just start going with, let me do my setup here. Okay, so in plain words, today, I'm going to talk about how to run and maintain an innovation facility in a corporate environment like P&G. And number two, what are your cognitive style preferences to do innovation? Those are like the two building blocks. Okay, a little bit about me. So if you read my bio, you've seen most of this. I'll just elaborate and say that I'm a Puerto Rican native. And, when you do the DNA testing, I'm 90% Spanish, and I have a little bit of sprinkles of Italian and French. I speak English and Spanish, a bit of Portuguese and Italian. I see we have somewhat of a international audience. I think we have someone from Brazil. So bon dia to you and the rest of you. I am married to Marlene, my wife, and I have 13-year-old twins, Lucy and Ricardo. So Lucy and Ricky, it's an easy way to remember for a Puerto Rican native. Okay, so that's a little bit about me. And like Mark said, I recently retired from P&G in August, and I am now Vice President of Corporate Architecture for Basadur Applied Innovation. Okay, so let's start with the gym, and just understanding when you think about the gym as a capability in a corporate environment like Procter and Gamble, it was really about energizing and strengthening superior product innovation. And the way we did that is that we created very tailored experience for teams that would result in tangible, actionable prototypes for P&G innovation challenges. And while we do that, then the gym as a capability help enable P&G's innovation culture be a best-in-class processes, people, and place. And kind of like you see some, snapshots here of active gym sessions or gym sessions running. So that's really what the gym's mission was about. So when you think about, what initiatives or what innovations did the gym touch? So thinking about the periods between 2010 and 2020, we pretty much touched every innovation that P&G launched into the marketplace, right? So all of it was really influenced by the gym. The kind of like an internal saying is at some point, everyone at P&G comes to the gym. Okay, so when you think about the anatomy of a workshop, I thought this was a good way for this audience to understand. If I am a P&G employee, how can the gym help, right? And the first step was really define what are you trying to accomplish. And typically, P&G teams would come to the gym when they had a challenge that they needed to overcome, either because they were kicking off a project or they were stuck with a business question. So they really need to understand, what is a business objective, which could range of things like, I need to define my innovation pipeline for the next 10 years for diapers, for Pampers, or I need to figure out what the right organizational structure is, if you're someone from human resources, right? So we would take a broad set of customers coming to the gym, but it was important for them to understand, okay, what do you want to accomplish? Then you would book the gym workshop. So we would take care of all of the logistics, and then we would enable coaching on if you need to design the right workshop. Then you show up and execute the workshop, and it's up to the P&G team to implement the results. So I put together here this kind of like pyramid that starts following Maslow's hierarchy structure. And I'm going to kind of like go through each of these operational building blocks on the operational model. So it starts at the bottom with the physical venue, then you move into the operations team, the people that runs the facility. Then the critical element of the facilitator network and the tools that those facilitators would bring into bear with the teams. Then the role of what I call my role as a gym architect or the gym architects, right? Because there were several architects, and I see that Shannon Wage is actually showing us. So he's the other architect of the gym, and he's still, at P&G, even though Shannon is now in a new role, but he can just chime in later when we get to that point. And then ultimately, the tip of the pyramid is a subject matter expert. So I'll elaborate on what each of those elements means here shortly. So let's start with the venue, right? So when you think about the gym, a lot of people think that the gym is really a physical location, and that's true, right? And the important element of the physical location, when you think about Maslow's hierarchy, think about food and shelter, right? So in terms of the facility, we had 15 studios ranging from different capacities that could accommodate anywhere from a 20 people studio, and our largest studio could accommodate about 300 people in round tables, even though most of our studios essentially had capacity of 20 to 40 people. Okay, we had prototyping supplies. We had what I call brain food and drinks, right? So we had a freestyle Coke machine that was free, right? Because it's all for the corporate environment. We had several wings to the facility, and one of the critical elements is the arrival experience. So the reception, like when a team would book a session, that arrival experience needed to be very smooth. So that's everything from registration, checking in, like knowing where to go. And finally, on the slide, we actually had an inconspicuous location offsite. So I remember talking to Mark earlier, as we were like getting this presentation ready, then he made a comment of, okay, the gym should have a very fancy architecture building. And I said, actually, no, it's the opposite. We actually wanted for it to have a low profile. And the reason for that is that we actually wanted this facility to be unbranded because we didn't want the P&G branding to bias the opinion of people or consumers or whomever is coming into this, thinking that because of P&G's equity that, we didn't want that to influence their behavior or their perception of the work that they were about to do. So actually we wanted to keep a low profile. And the other important element of this location is that we actually wanted to be offsite from the official P&G corporate buildings, because there's a big element and a very powerful element of like getting people out of their offices. Okay, so that kind of like covers the physical venue elements of the gym. So now moving into the operations level, this really about is the daily logistics and planning elements of running this facility from day to day. So this included an operations manager that essentially had the responsibility of managing a team of contractors that would take care of everything from the catering to where the Diet Cokes are coming from, or where the coffee is coming from, and any other needs that the team would need. And having a team of contractors, and these are actually not P&G employees, the team of contractors enable us to adjust the staffing based on the demand, especially because in these types of facilities, you have ebbs and flow of the volume. And that's just a lot easier to manage if you have a team of contractors. We had an on-site supervisor, which actually enabled us to manage a lot of the co-employment risks. When you actually work with contractors, there's a lot of HR guidelines on that you have to take care of to make sure that you don't get into a co-employment situation. And in short, in simple terms, it's really you don't want to assign an assignment to a contractor for a job that a P&G person could do, right? And vice versa. So really managing that element was important for us to operate. And we also had a yearly audiovisual team contract. In this case was, the resident AV operators at P&G, which is Mills James LLC. But this structure enabled us to be cost effective and at the same time run the facility. We also had an online planning and execution system, and also doing a lot of the internal paperwork at P&G, because the way the finances work at P&G is that there's a cross-charging system that, we would charge teams for the services that we were providing, and that was critical for our sustainable operation. I also mentioned, the food, catering, snacks, and this actually was one of our highest rated elements. Like, people love the food. And keeping those brains fed and happy was important. And then number 5 is really the daily staging of the studios, depending on what the team what the team was trying to accomplish. So our philosophy on studio management at the gym, I call it the Broadway principle. So when you go to see a play in Broadway, you go to one of those theaters. When a new play comes in, it's actually an empty canvas, and then that stage is customized depending on what the play is. So depending on what the teams need where, we would leverage the operations team to really stage that studio to the needs of the team. And later on, when I talk about subject matter experts, I'll tell you about one time we turned one of our studios into a fashion studio, right? Where we brought in sewing machines and tailors and seamstresses, to do that type of work. So depending on what the team was trying to accomplish, we would need to have that flexibility. So, one of the rules that we had at the gym was that everything needs to be on wheels and everything needs to be modular. We need to be able to get it in and out of the studio pretty quickly, because we need to turn the studio from one day to the next. Okay, so that was the other principle in operations. And the most important element, if you think about having a effective workshop experience for a team, is really the facilitators and the tools, right? Which I think this audience can relate to, from a design thinker's perspective, right? Because you can actually have a gym session anywhere, right? So if you ask me what's the most important element of this pyramid, is this green element of the facilitators and the tools. And the way that played out for the gym was that we needed to have a network of vetted facilitators across different specialties, right? So when I was thinking about vetting a gym facilitator, there's 3 elements that were critical for this. The first element is having some industry experience, or as Shannon and I used to talk about, this person needs to have scars on their back, right? So there's a lot of value from having that real world experience to be able to be in a situation with a real team. The other element was really, this person needs to be a competent tool practitioner of either internal or external methodologies, things like design thinking, theory of inventive problem solving, creative problem solving, you name it, right? There's a lot of methodologies out there. So this person needed to have some kind of skill set across the methodology that a team could benefit from. And for me, one of the critical ones was the ability to read the room and change the script in real time to meet the team's need. And in this audience, I'm sure that you can relate that there were times that maybe you were doing some work with a team and something shifted and someone threw a grenade, or essentially the plan that you have created for this team is no longer valid. So you actually needed to change the script on the fly to meet the needs of the team. Right, and a lot of it could be triggered by maybe the fact that the problem was not well defined ahead of time, or maybe there were some new players that came into the session that kind of like changed the framing of the session, etc. Right, so that ability to read the room and realize, okay, we need to pivot. And also being able to make that pivot in real time was also a critical element that I looked for when I was vetting facilitators. So it all comes down into, kind of like this 4-diamond model. And I call it the Perez 4-diamond workshop framework, that we would look at any team that's coming into the gym needs to have a permutation of these 4 steps, right? So they need to have effectively define their problem, or be in the start of defining the problem and finishing that in the session. Then they need to move into an ideation type of activity. Then they need to move into some kind of prototype realization type of activity. And then they need to come out with an activation plan, right? And the important element here is that when the workshop is over, what happens in the real world, right? Because the risk was that a lot of times there was a lot of energy leaving the session and then nothing happened in the real world. So there was this emphasis on what is your activation plan, right? And that was really a key element that needed to be driven by the facilitator network and ultimately the team leaders, right? The owner of the problem. So I kind of like cover some of the elements of the facilitator and tools element. And then this kind of like pretty much defines what I thought my role was at the gym, which is really managing and integrating all of the elements of the pyramid. And one key elements of what I needed to deliver was that, number one, you need to have someone that knows what they're talking about. They need to have experience, and having been an innovation practitioner, it goes back to having some scars on your back and industry experience that I mentioned before. In my role, I ended up doing a lot of VIP facilitation, right? Sessions that were either very challenging or for senior management. Then I would not only was playing the role of manager, but I also needed to continue to practice the craft, really to stay close to the tools and the day-to-day, which enabled me to be better at vetting facilitators and also curating best-in-class tools, right? Because there's a lot of tools that are out there in the ecosystem, and there's always a question of, is this a tool that we should engage with as an organization? That's different than being a gatekeeper. This is not being a gatekeeper, but really validating and curating what the best-in-class tools are, and also being able to advise the company against tools that were not that good, right? So sometimes, you know, there's a lot of snake oil in our field. And Shannon is laughing because he probably is thinking about a specific one that he and I did. And we actually wrote this summary that went all the way to the Chief Innovation Officer. And our recommendation was that we should pass on this one, because after we ran some tests with teams, the thing was just totally, you know, not worth it. So that's part of that role, is really having that curation role. There's also the development of new tools and capabilities, because this is the notion of really innovating how we innovate, right? And really thinking about that field in an intentional way, right? So anyway, that covers the gym architect part. And the last part of the pyramid, like I mentioned before, we would stage the studio and we would stage a session depending on what the needs are. So the gym operations really enable setting up the innovation space and the innovation experience that team needed. So some of these examples are that at a time we brought in ballerinas from the Cincinnati Ballet to do a femcare body movement study for Always and Tampax. At some point, we turned, like I mentioned, one of our studios into a Project Runway set, where we were prototyping garments for baby care, diapers, and pretty much, you know, every week we would bring consumers for input, ideation, and prototype reaction. That's just a common practice at P&G. So we would enable those logistics as well. Okay, so this brings me into, you know, what are the performance indicators for the gym? So this slide, I start with the gym traffic metrics. So, you know, how many people would come through the gym? So when I took over, you know, and this is kind of like the solid database that I had in this period of 6 years, right? So we started with about, you know, almost 6,000 people coming through the gym in fiscal year 11-12, and we continued to grow that from year to year. And in 16-17, we were about 25,000 people coming through the gym. And the way to normalize that number is really how many session days did we have. So if you have a group of people in a studio for a day, that's what a session day is. Yeah. Okay, so you kind of like see the increasing number, you know, from about 450 to about 1,200 in 16-17. So that gives you an idea of the sheer volume and traffic of
this blew me away, Richard, when you first showed this to me, and that's how I was like, what does this place look like? And on your slide, when you had the sort of office park warehouse looking buildings, I was like, oh, I get it now. There's a north building and a south building, and you're doing, you know, you got 24,000, 25,000 people going through this thing, and, you know, 1,200 sessions. That's a scale that most of us can barely get our heads around. So that's super cool. I just wanted to jump in there. We do have a few questions, but I'm gonna let you wrap that up.
Yes, I have one more slide on metrics, and then we can do the banter if that works. But then hold that thought for our backstage conversation, because I have some stories about why the two buildings and what were some of the cost reasons why we were in those buildings. And, you know, what did we have on north and south, rather than just have one building, right? So I'll tell you, that story.
Cool.
So the other element that we have here is the gym experience metric. So we started using Net Promoter Score, right? Which is a basic question of, would you recommend the gym to an esteemed friend or colleague? And you kind of like see that value climbing. And there's some things that we optimize across the years to improve that experience. So notice that how we started around that 39% Net Promoter Score. And essentially by the time we realized all of the building blocks of the pyramid, you know, the right way, we were at 95% Net Promoter Score, which is really a huge benchmark. So when you look at the footnote, you know, at that time, this was in 2015, when you look at Net Promoter Scores of other benchmarks like Apple, Amazon, and Facebook, it ranged from 60 to 80%. and we were at 95% consistently. So that was a huge experience metrics for us. And as part of that, we also measured, what is your satisfaction rating on meeting the workshop objectives? So you came to the gym for a reason. How well did we do? Or how well did your team do to really meet that objective, right? So we were at a 9.3 above 9 pretty much. So the teams were having a good experience. And the other metric that we were managing is the value rating, right? Because the teams would actually have to pay a cross charge to cover their costs coming in. And there were some fixed costs that they need to pay for. So essentially it was a rate per person. So anyway, it was a good value, it's the bottom line for that. And here's some of, a word cloud on some of the gym feedback to reinforce the metrics.
Right.
And as you can see, pretty positive, all over the place. Anything from awesome day, great, outstanding, gym staff was great, etc. And this is the last metric, salary. And, at some point I went and did a calculation, when the question came up of what is the value of the gym? What is the return on investment? So as a corporate capability, there's always a question of, what is your value and how do you justify your existence? So the exercise that I did, I just took a very simple approach looking at what is the time compression benefit that the gym is providing from the work that we do by creating these workshop experiences for team. So the way this calculation goes, right? So you look at the number of workshops across the 8 years, which is where I have a solid database. So that's about 106,000 people that came through, right? And I looked at the salary of those people, and on average, when you include benefits and retirement plans, etc., and essentially from a budget planning standpoint, how much money do you have to allocate to maintain a full-time employee? That's about $150,000 a year. And at P&G, most people essentially work from 3 to 5 projects, right? So allocated that when people come to the gym, they're usually working on one of those projects, right? So if I give that one project a value out of 5, that's around $30,000 per project.
Yep.
Then when we ask people, okay, so, and it's a question below, considering the result and output of the application workshop you just experienced, in the absence of this workshop, how long do you think it would have taken for you to achieve the same output through conventional work processes like email, team meetings, etc.? And the average response about, oh, you saved me at least 3 months of work, right, which is about 25% of the year, right? That's 1 quarter. So then I assign a dollar value based on their salary of, okay, so that those 3 months are worth $7,500 a person. So when you do the math, the total time compression salary savings over 8 years is $800,000 million, right? Almost $1 billion, depending on, what the assumptions that you make. Yeah. And then I calculated out number 7, the average yearly savings enabled by the gym are at least $100 million a year. So when you look about what my all-in budget is to run the facility, so paying the rent for the buildings, and this included the pass-through costs, the cross charges that we made to each of the teams, that's about $3 million. So when you calculate the return on investment, that's a 3,321% return.
Yeah, and I have a question on this. So that's a very impressive number. You guys cross-bill inside of P&G, right? And if I understood correctly, you also bring in you do outside work. So you're not only a cost center, you're actually a profit center, which is a really good way of framing it from a corporate standpoint. Is that $3 million the operational budget of the gym, or is that more or less than the operational budget?
It's the all-in budget. So it includes a fixed budget plus a variable cost.
Cool.
Right. Cool. So let's say that we run 0 workshops in a year. There's still some bills that you have to pay, right? You have to pay utilities, you have to pay the lease, etc. Right. So we needed that budget allocated to us every year. Also, the 4 full-time employees that were part of the gym team, P&G employees, needed to be paid, right? So we needed like that secure. The rest of the costs are the variable costs. So for example, the food and catering depends on how many people came through, right? Because we would not buy more food than what we needed, right? And we would cross-charge that back to the teams. So we could have been a profit center if we wanted to. We chose not to, right? Because that's not our business model.
Right.
So we could talk separately about the possibility of doing that. There was this idea of, should we actually monetize the gym externally, right? But that's a good conversation. But the answer to your question is no. This was all
we can get into some of those details in the backstage. Just for everybody who hasn't been here, we'll have a backstage discussion that starts at the top of the hour. We'll stay on for another half an hour with Richard, and we'll be able to have a unrecorded version. It's kind of the more informal discussion. So we encourage anybody that wants to have a deeper discussion with Richard to stick around for another half an hour at the end. I think we'll jump to what we have time for, probably for one question, Richard, and then we'll want to get into talk about the profile.
Excellent.
I'm going to ask Swarina if you want to ask your question, if you are able to come off mute. Otherwise, I can ask your question for you. I'll give you a second to. There you go.
Hi.
I think you.
Hello.
Yeah, you had a question about how this differs with a sprint, right?
Yes, as well as what's the tentative timeline of the projects that you mentioned?
Okay, so I think the question was, how is this different than sort of a Google Ventures design sprint, or how are the activities that you do? And I imagine you have different formats and stuff like that. And then what are the timelines of the projects, which I guess is not just the work that you're doing in the gym, but like somebody comes in the gym with a project where they have a thorny problem they're trying to work out, or an opportunity they're exploring. And then, are these 9-month projects, 3-year projects, or 3-day projects?
Yes, it's all of the above, right? Because when you have an ecosystem like P&G, which has about 80,000 employees globally, and out of that, about 7,500 to 8,000 are research and development, which was the bias of the gym. You had a range of projects. So we have teams coming in that would be in 90-day cycles, right? And we would create that experience customized for them, right? You had other projects that were looking at more at a 10-year innovation pipeline, right? So that's a very different time frame. And depending on what business unit you're on, for example, if you're in a high capital investment type of business, like paper, like diapers or paper making, etc., the manufacturing machines for those business units cost millions of dollars, right? So they're usually in extended life cycles that they're working at, like 10-year increments. So their projects tended to be a little longer. But then you have business units like beauty, right? So beauty is more in a 6-month cycle. So they needed to formulate and quickly launch into market. So we actually had a range of needs met. And some of those could fit the profile of what a Google Sprint would do, but not all of them. It depends on the business unit and the needs of the team.
So there's some shorter term things depending on where the team is, and then some longer term strategic planning type of things that you're looking at. That's really cool. So I just want to shout out to you, Richard. We're at 20 minutes to the hour. Got 20 minutes left, so we'll need a little bit of time right at the end to introduce next week's session. I suggest we jump into the profile and go through the introduction very quickly so we can jump into the mural activity. Really
Excellent,
quick.
Let's do it. So these are the last 3 points, right? So having an intentional innovation facility, integrating people, place, and process will drive culture. This capability drives an attractive return on investment on salary, time, compression, value alone, because I'm not taking credit for any of the better ideas or resulting innovation themselves, because that's very hard to do and measure. And corporations that are interested in innovative ecosystem and culture can benefit from applying the pyramid model. So with that, we had the question already, so I'll move into the second piece, unless you want to do one more question before we jump into the profile. Mark, your call.
I think we can do the questions towards the end. Let's just jump into the profile so we have enough time for that.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so this is an example of one of the most powerful tools that we applied at the gym. Back to my point around a critical enabler being the facilitator and tools to really create these workshop experiences for team. And of course, this connects to the Scatterbrains book if you want to learn more about it. You could go into Amazon, it's like, $15, so it's just 60 pages. So it's just a very practical guide. So the premise here is that innovative performance is a balance of knowledge, imagination, experimentation, evaluation, and action, right? But we all have different and complementing styles of using this combination. So pragmatically think about things that you like to do when you're solving a problem or you're innovating, and things that you don't like to do as much. So for example, there's some people like love to do brainstorming, some people that hate to do brainstorming, some people that love doing Excel spreadsheets to quantify all of the critical elements of a problem, and some people that just hate an Excel spreadsheet, right? So think about all of the activities that you do. There are some that you have a bias towards preferring versus not. So that's essentially the premise of a two-vector model, which is represented by this slide. So on the vertical axis, to solve a problem, people need to first acquire knowledge or gain knowledge. So there's a bipolar preference of how you do that, either by gaining knowledge by direct experience or gaining knowledge by detached or abstract thinking. So an example here, I use an IKEA furniture analogy, right? So if you're the type of person that buys an IKEA piece of furniture and actually reads the instructions first, fills out the warranty card before you actually assemble the thing, you're more of a thinker. Right? If you're the type of person that jumps in and just figures it out as you go, kind of like assembling the thing, you're more of an experiential person, right? So that's one dimension of how you gain knowledge. The other dimension is how you prefer to use that knowledge, right? So on the right is really about having a preference for ideation or divergent thinking. On the left is really having a preference for evaluation or judging the options, right? So when you kind of like put those two vectors together, you get a 4-quadrant model that essentially creates the 4 styles, right? So the first style, which we call the generators, are people that love getting things started and they have new problems and challenges. They value different perspectives. They like to create new options and really dream about the possibilities. Then the other quadrant, number 2, which are also prefer doing ideation or divergent thinking. And also they like to do a lot of mental modeling of the real world. They're great at defining problems and understanding the big picture and the connections. They love putting ideas together. They're very abstract thinkers. They create new insights, and they really are about understand the why of things. Those are conceptualizers. Then when you move into the thinkers that actually like to converge and evaluate options, that's what we call the optimizers. And they love turning ideas into practical solutions and plans. They're very analytical. These are the spreadsheet people, right? That love Excel spreadsheets. And they're really at action planning. And finally, when you have people that are very experiential and like to really focus on the priorities, that's what we call the implementers, that essentially they make things happen in the real world. That's what we call the implementers. And they just need to know enough to get going. They can adapt to changing circumstances. They just make it work in the real world, right? So that's essentially the model. So hopefully you can see yourself in one or more of these quadrants, and we're going to go and do that exercise here in a little bit. The other element to understand about these styles, when you think about the creative problem solving process, generators are naturally good at problem finding and fact finding. Conceptualizers are naturally good at problem definition and idea finding. Optimizers are great at planning and converging into the critical few ideas. And implementers are great at driving acceptance and action in the real world, right? So the key things to understand here, and this is what I call the quadrant tensions or the swirl drivers within a team. So every time you've worked with a team, you might have seen some of these swirl behaviors. And a lot of times that dysfunctionality happens because the tensions shown here have not been resolved. So for example, when you think about the generators' view of optimizers, they think that they're too narrow-minded, they cannot see the big pictures, they think they know what the right answer is, but might be for the wrong problem. On the other side of the coin, when you think about the optimizers' view of generators, is that these generators are unable to focus, they start working on 5 things before one is solved, and they're hard to pin down. So kind of like see what the tensions are, because their cognitive preferences on how they approach a problem. And then you kind of like see the other side of the coin, the two sides of the coin between implementers and conceptualizers. So this is a very powerful framework to really understand team dynamics. And they might sound obvious, but a lot of times you actually see these behaviors at play, and teams don't even realize that that's actually what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so moving on into, when you actually do out the 10-minute questionnaire, right, on the tool, you kind of like get this plot, and this is actually mine, right? So you kind of like see what the different quadrants look like. And this one says that I have a bias towards conceptualization with that 46%. And I have a kind of like an equal balance between generator and optimizer, and I'm less of an implementer, right? So that's just an example of what the plot looks like and kind of like where the dot lands. So when you take a team and you do this for an entire team, you're going to have many dots. And when you put all of those together, all of those dots together, you're going to have what we call a scatter diagram. Right, so each dot represents the center of gravity of the different people on this team. Mm-hmm. So this example shows the distribution of the Westchester Fire Department. And as you can see, not surprisingly, after everything I explained, that firefighters in general, they tend to focus on putting the fire out. Right, that's really what firefighters do. So it's not surprising that a lot of them tends to have a preference towards implementation in their work. The next example, when you have an entrepreneurship and venture capital association, you actually see a lot of divergent thinkers, and a lot of them generate their quadrants. So that's interesting to see, kind of like, depending on what team's objective is, what that distribution tends to be. Here's another example of air traffic controllers, right? It's kind of a joke of, aren't we glad, especially those of us that have flown recently, right? It's really about just focus on landing the plane, right? Which is a very implementation focus. Here's another example of a Lean Six Sigma symposium. And when you think about Six Sigma, which is really about making sure that everything is within that normal curve in control at a Six Sigma range, there's a lot of optimization and implementation that tends to happen as part of that. Here's kind of like a joke between a market research team that looks like this on the conceptualization side, and then they're pitching this 57 pages of research into the sales organization that tends to be more of an implementer mindset. Mm-hmm. So think about, how that might go and how to frame your message so that those two groups really can build on each other rather than cancel each other out. Okay, so to finish this part, the key thing to understand about team distribution is that everyone is a blend.
Yep.
It's about states, not traits. It's about what state you're in and how you need to behave to be effective. Our research says that heterogeneous teams perform more innovatively, but tend to have less satisfaction versus homogeneous, because they don't necessarily complete each other's thoughts, but they actually complement each other, which is actually more powerful. That's what we call cognitive diversity. Then depending on context, your orientation is less important than your ability to shift among the quadrants to be effective, depending on the situation that you're in. You can be trained and skilled in all quadrants, and that's also, a key skills that facilitators can have. The data says that generators are in shorter supply in corporations, and we see a bias towards different jobs depending on your style. And finally, a facilitator can successfully guide a team through all the steps independent of team distribution. Okay, so this kind of like brings us into our MURAL exercise. So Mark, are we ready to move into that?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to do it like super quick, like in just give people 30 seconds to a minute to plot themselves on this mural. I think you've done a great job of teeing this up. Why don't we just get everybody to stick a sticky note on the mural so that we just get a feel for what this group that's on this call looks like, what the profile, and then we can have a quick chat about that, because we've got about 10 minutes left. We'll have about 8 minutes left. We'll need 2 minutes at the end.
Okay, you enter as a visitor like I'm doing now. So MURAL will assign you an animal name. So you could use that animal name. I'm a koala, right? So yeah, just grab one of the existing stickies here and then type your identifier, koala. And given everything that I talked about, kind of like drag your post it to where you think your style is, and then we'll look at what that looks like. And this is the last activity we'll do today.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm seeing a lot of movement towards the right hemisphere, so I'm not surprised. And I think we have about, what, about 12 people on the call, maybe?
Yeah, we have 15 folks. Yeah, including
Okay.
us. Yeah.
Okay, so looking at what that distribution is looking like, any observations from anyone, on the phone, on what you think that means?
Yeah. Yeah, what it means. I guess we need some Waynes so that we can so that we can get stuff done. We do seem to be a little bit heavy on the conceptualizers. It is weighted in that direction towards conceptualizing. So that's what I'm seeing.
Hey, Shannon, sorry to put you on the spot. You have any thoughts on this? If you're able to open your audio. And I actually see that Dr. Min Basadur has joined us as well. So he may have some thoughts as well, because he's the creator of this tool.
Yeah, so thanks for the invitation, Richard. I would just tell you that we better have a bias for action, because we're going to have a lot of great ideas. We're going to find a lot of problems to solve, but we are going to be well tasked to put some energy of putting some action together, and even making a plan, having a really sound plan to how to activate this. So I'm not so much worried about the brainstorming session or the ideation function of this, but at the end of the session, we better have some strong agreement, some violent agreement that we're going in the right direction.
Right.
And then actually do it.
I totally agree, Shannon. And what I would advise here is that we need to find that partner on the opposite hemisphere that essentially will complete us, right? So rather than have that person cancel us, we actually need to partner and really put ourselves in their shoes and have that person put themselves in our shoes. And this is actually where this profile tool is very powerful to do that effectively. So you build on each other rather than cancel each other out, because unfortunately, there's a lot of canceling happening in corporations and in the world today. We see everything from politics to corporations. So I think that's a big takeaway. And for this population, I'm not surprised that there's a strong bias towards the right hemisphere. Which is not good or bad, is a fact. So the question is now, how can we use that to our advantage in an intentional way? So that's all I have to say about that, unless there are many questions, and we can move to wrap up this part.
Yeah, why don't we open it up for questions? What are your thoughts, insights from Richard's excellent description of how the gym works and this Basadur profile? And feel free to either put your question in the chat or just come off mute and ask it out loud.
Yeah, I'll just have to say that Wayne Fisher seems to be an outlier, which is not surprising to him.
Swarina, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just have a question. Like, if you see this Miro board right now, we have many people on the right. So, and that too, it's us deciding where we fit. So how do you evaluate a person, and what is their skill, what's their strength, and how do you manage that? Understanding the person and their way of working.
It's a great question. This is a qualitative version of self-characterizing yourself, and it works about 80% of the time. But that's actually what the tool does. So the actual tool, it's a 10-minute questionnaire, which has been validated 5 times. We'll give you a better assessment in an unbiased way of what your preferences are. So that's just another way to validating, did you get it right? So there's a link to the actual profile tool where you do the 10-minute questionnaire. If you actually get the book for $15, you actually get a free promotion code to do the assessment. So the assessment costs $60 and the book costs $15, right? So those are ways for you to validate if you feel you want to do that, and then see how you did. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Yeah.
Anybody else have a question for Richard?
I
Michelle?
do. Hi. When I saw this, it made perfect sense to me based on where we are. And I was like, oh, my peoples,
You're in your tribe, right?
Yeah, I'm in my tribe. But I totally understand the drawbacks. So my question is, when you have teams that are overwhelmingly on one side, like the example she showed, is there a resource that you can point us to that helps us to get them to recognize those shortcomings as a result and compensate for it? Like, for example,
that's a great question. So I'll talk about the firefighter example here. The objective of the session, they actually wanted to create a strategy for the next 10 years, which is not implementation work. It's more conceptualization work. I spent 2 days with them and using essentially this set of tools and this framework here, you could actually facilitate any distribution to accomplish their objective if they're naturally lacking in the ability to do that, because actually where the tools come in and where facilitation comes in. The important thing is to understand, for them to understand why, right? And really they need to be comfortable with their discomfort. Because what I tell people, for example, when I do this ahead of a session, I kind of like know what I'm walking into. And I take the team to the agenda, I design the session, I say, this is what the distribution looks like. And this is why some of you are going to be in excruciating pain through parts of the session. But the good news is actually endorphins are coming later, right? Because, for example, when you have people that prefer convergence, the early part of a session tends to be divergent, right? When you do brainstorming, ideation, and that kind of thing. So this is a great resource to manage the psyche and the attitudes of a team and essentially guide them towards where they need to go, like I did with the firefighter example here. Does that help illustrate?
Yes. And it's a simple solution, I guess, in the sense that we acknowledge it, getting them to, you're going to feel uncomfortable. This is out of your comfort zone, but as a facilitator, I'm here to guide you through. So having that.
Right. Exactly. And this leads to this final slide, which is, this is actually, when you look at the entire database of the profile, which now actually has about 100,000 people, but the distribution is the same. This is kind of like what the world looks like in corporations and academia, right? So this is an ecosystem that all of us need to be successful in. So for this audience, when you have something like this, and I'm going to the mural here. Okay, so this is kind of like what our distribution looks like, right? Which tends to be on the right side, of the equation of the hemisphere, but then realize that this, us as contributors need to be effective in this ecosystem, right? Let me go back to the slide here. Right, this is kind of what I call the cloud chart. Right, so you better kind of be aware of what these people are expecting, if you're actually going to walk into that. And there's ways to do that, right? This is, which is the other slide, a facilitator can help you guide. All of these skills can be learned. So to that point, the final advice is called the secret sauce from Dr. Basadur, which is really separating divergent behaviors from convergent behaviors. And the way to do that is by using deferral of judgment, which is very easy to say, very, very hard to do. So with that, I want to thank everyone. And that brings me to the end of my talk. And I think, Mark, back to you.
Great. We'll jump here to the backstage in just a moment, and we can dig more into those discussions. Now, I'm just want to make sure I'm sharing my screen, the right screen. Are you seeing the next session 117, or are you seeing my screen? I'm not sure. Are you seeing the, yes,
I'm
okay,
seeing your
great.
screen, yes.
I'm gonna hand it over to Steve real quick. Steve, 2 seconds. Tell us about what's coming next week.
Sure. So next week we have Jeroen Spolstra, and he'll be letting us experience life-centered design. The idea is that we always look at an organization's stakeholders in design, but we neglect the other 80% of the world around us. So we want to put the world around, we don't want to put the world around us at risk. So how do we better understand what life-centered design is? And that's what Jeroen will be showing us.
That sounds really interesting. So we'll be digging into not just human stakeholders, but the rest of the stakeholders in our environment. Cool, thanks, Steve. And just for y'all, know that you can submit an idea for a talk at the Wednesday Web Jam. That this information, the links are in the chat. You can also like and follow us on our socials. And we're getting ready to go into backstage. That's where we are right now, actually. So I'm going to stop the recording and stop sharing. And you're welcome to stick around and have more of a conversation with